I remember the last time I saw them. It's funny how time distorts memories. How things blur with the passing years. But that moment, that last argument, is burned into my mind with a clarity that still shocks me. If I close my eyes, I can see it all, the way my mother's eyes narrowed as she stood by the kitchen counter. The way my father's jaw clenched as he spoke to me like I was a stranger. It felt like they were speaking a language I didn't understand, and I was drowning in it. I was 18, still figuring out who I was, still trying to fit into a world that felt too small for me. They had plans for me, big plans, a future they had already mapped out, one where I was successful, respectable, and in line with their version of good enough. They had this idea of who I should be, who I must be. They didn't see me for who I was, just for who they wanted me to be. And I couldn't do it anymore. I had always been the good kid, the one who followed the rules, who did what they asked. But I had begun to feel like a shell of myself, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. The more I tried to please them, the more I lost touch with who I really was. It started with small things. The way my father raised an eyebrow when I mentioned wanting to be an artist. Or the way my mother brushed off my desire to travel, as if those things were beneath me. Then there were the bigger things, the school I wanted to attend. The friends I made, the dreams I had that didn't fit into their neat, preordained box. Every time I tried to step outside the mold they had set for me, there was a subtle reprimand, a disapproving glance, a cold silence. But it was the day I told them I wasn't going to take the job they'd arranged for me in a law office that it all came crashing down. I had been accepted into an art school in New York, one of the most prestigious in the country, and I was ready to leave. To finally chase my own dreams. To carve my own path. I had thought they would be proud of me. Or at least understand. After all, I had always been a good student. The one they bragged about at family gatherings. But when I told them, when I looked into their faces and saw the surprise turning into disappointment, I realized just how wrong I was. My father's voice was the first to break the silence. You can't be serious. He had a way of saying things that made me feel like a child. Like my dreams didn't matter. You're going to throw away a secure future for art. His tone was a mixture of disbelief and disgust. I had seen that look before, but it had never been aimed at me. My mother's response was quieter, but no less cutting. This is ridiculous. Do you think you can just waste your life chasing some fantasy? You're smarter than that. I tried to explain. I tried to tell them that this wasn't a fantasy. That this was something I had worked for. Something I was passionate about. But the more I spoke, the angrier they became. My words fell on deaf ears. It felt like the harder I fought to be understood, the further away I was pushed. It wasn't just the art school that bothered him, it was everything. The way I was suddenly becoming someone they didn't recognize. The way I was thinking for myself. Making my own decisions. Becoming myself. I didn't belong in their carefully crafted world. And it terrified them. And then came the words that shattered everything. You're no longer welcome here. My father said, his voice shaking with anger. We won't support this nonsense. If you choose this path, you're choosing to leave us. I remember the silence that followed. I had never heard him say anything like that before. There was no going back after that. I looked at my mother, hoping for some kind of support. But she just stood there, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She didn't say a word, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. It was as if I had failed them in a way that went beyond anything I could fix. The room felt small and suffocating. The air was thick with anger, regret, and something else, something deeper. It was as if a door had slammed shut between us, and no matter how hard I tried to push against it, it wouldn't open. In the end, I left without a fight. What could I say? I had always believed that family was everything, that we would be there for each other no matter what. But in that moment, it felt like they weren't my family anymore. They were strangers. I packed my things that night, just a few clothes, some essentials, and left. I didn't look back, at least, not for a long time. The first year after I left was like being tossed into the deep end of a pool with no life raft. I couldn't swim. I didn't even know where the water would take me. But I had to move. I had to keep going, even when I couldn't see the bottom. It was strange, at first, how quiet everything was. My family had always been loud, demanding, full of opinions and expectations. The house had been a constant hum, my mother's voice in the kitchen, my father's stern directives, the weight of their presence in every room. When I left, I stepped into a world of silence. The apartment I rented was small and cold. The floors creaked under my feet, and the walls seemed to close in on me as I sat in the empty space, staring at my half-unpacked boxes. There was no one there to tell me what to do, no one there to tell me I wasn't good enough, or that I wasn't living up to some standard they had set for me. But there was also no one to tell me I was okay, to offer a kind word when I felt lost. I spent the first few weeks in a fog, trying to piece together the fragments of my old life while struggling to find my place in the new one. I'd been so used to having a roadmap, a plan that I didn't realize how little I actually knew about myself. I'd spent my whole life pleasing them, trying to be what they wanted, and now that I was free, I didn't know who I was. I took a job at a small coffee shop down the street, working long hours behind the counter. I hated it at first, cleaning tables, making lattes, listening to people's shallow conversations about their days, but slowly, something shifted. The customers, the regulars who came in every day, became my new community. There was a woman named Maggie who came in every morning at 7:30 a.m. Right before work, she'd order a caramel macchiato and sit in the corner with her laptop, typing furiously. At first, I didn't think much of her. She was just another customer, a face in the crowd. But after a few weeks, I started noticing little things about her. She was always smiling, always in a good mood, even when the rest of us were dragging. She had a kindness about her, a sense of peace that was contagious. One morning, I finally decided to ask her about it. "Do you ever get tired of all this?" I asked, gesturing vaguely to the cafe and then to myself. "I mean, don't you just want to do something else?" She looked up from her laptop, her brown eyes warm. "I used to," she said, "but I found a way to make peace with it. You can't always control what life throws at you, but you can decide how to react. And when you stop fighting, you realize you're exactly where you're supposed to be." I wasn't sure I understood what she meant, but the words stuck with me. Maybe that's what I needed, peace. I hadn't known what that was until I left. All I had known was chaos, the demands, the pressure, the suffocating expectations. Now, in this small cafe, I had a strange kind of calm. I didn't know where I was headed, but I was learning to let go of the idea that I had to have it all figured out. My apartment was a reflection of this new state of being cluttered. Mismatched furniture, but cozy in a way. I started painting again. Art school had felt like a far-off dream back then, something I was terrified of pursuing. But now it was something I wanted more than anything. I would spend hours working on small canvases, finding colors and shapes that felt true to me. At night, I'd sit in front of the window, watching the city lights flicker, feeling the weight of the world slip away with each stroke of the brush. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I felt like I was drowning. I would catch myself wishing for my family, for the familiar arguments, the sound of their voices. The absence of them left a hollow space in my heart that nothing seemed to fill. Sometimes, late at night, I would wonder if I had made a mistake. Had I been too stubborn, too rash? Could I have done things differently? But when those thoughts crept in, I reminded myself of what had driven me to leave. I reminded myself that it wasn't just about the art, or the job I didn't want. It was about me, my future. I had chosen myself. One afternoon, a few months into my new life, I went to the local art gallery for a show. I didn't know why I had chosen it. Maybe it was just the pull of something familiar, but when I walked through the doors, I was overwhelmed. It wasn't the size of the space, or the grandeur of the paintings that moved me. It was the feeling that something in me had finally clicked. I stood in front of a painting, a chaotic swirl of colors, reds and blues clashing in a stormy, passionate mess, and I felt my chest tighten. I understood it. I understood what the artist was saying. I understood the wildness, the freedom, the breaking away from constraints. It was as if that painting was speaking to me. I had spent so much time trying to follow rules, trying to be what everyone wanted me to be. And here I was, finally starting to feel like I could be free. I wasn't a painter yet. I wasn't a professional artist, or even close to being one. But for the first time in a long time, I realized that I didn't need to be perfect. I didn't need their approval. I was enough. The next day, I signed up for classes at a community art center. It wasn't a giant leap, but it was mine. The years after I left my family felt like a strange mix of liberation and grief. I remember moments of pure joy, like when I sold my first painting at a local gallery show, or the first time I stood in front of a crowd, speaking about my work to a room full of strangers. These small victories, these accomplishments I had fought for on my own, were enough to fill my heart with pride. But at the same time, I carried this constant, nagging emptiness, a hole that no amount of art, no amount of work, could ever fill. It was around my third year in the city that I realized just how much I had grown. The quiet apartment that had once felt like a prison now felt like a sanctuary. I was comfortable here, the mornings were mine, and I had built a world around myself that wasn't reliant on anyone else's approval. But the loneliness never truly went away. I began to wonder if I would ever stop yearning for their love, for their approval. There were moments, like when I was painting, when I would catch myself wishing that they could see me now. Could they ever understand what I had built? Could they ever be proud of me for who I had become? I didn't want to admit it, but I missed them. It wasn't the version of them I had grown up with, the angry, disappointed, demanding parents, but the idea of them, the idea of a family that would show up for you, no matter what, that would stand by you through thick and thin. I wondered if I would ever have that again. But there were other moments when I was glad they were gone. Like when I made a decision for myself without wondering if they would approve. Or when I let myself fall in love for the first time since I'd left them. His name was Sam. He was a fellow artist I met at a show. Someone who understood what it meant to fight for your place in a world that often doesn't care. He was kind, generous, and gentle in a way that made me feel safe, even when I wasn't sure I deserved it. For a while, I was able to convince myself that I had it all. The career, the partner, the freedom, but there was always something lingering in the background, the unanswered questions. The unhealed wounds. No matter how much I tried to push it down, I couldn't erase the fact that my family was still out there. Somewhere, and they hadn't forgotten me. Then, one day, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. But I answered it anyway. There was a long pause on the other end. And then, in a voice I could barely recognize, my father spoke. I know it's been a long time. And I don't know if you'll even want to talk to me. But we need you to come home. Your mother is sick. The words hung in the air, and I could feel my stomach tighten. My heart pounded in my chest. The years of separation, the years of pretending I didn't care, suddenly felt insignificant in that moment. This was the moment I had been dreading. The moment I had both hoped for and feared. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I was strong enough to go back. I didn't know if I could face them. If I could walk into the house that had once been my prison and pretend like nothing had happened. I hadn't spoken to them in years. What had changed? I thought of all the times I had imagined them calling, begging me to return, asking for forgiveness. I had played these scenarios out in my mind 1,000 times. Always with the same question, would I go back? But this wasn't the same. My mother was sick, and even though they had hurt me, even though they had cast me aside, I knew that my family wasn't something you could just erase from your heart. I wasn't sure what to do, but I couldn't ignore the pull, the fear of losing him forever, of never getting the chance to make peace with what had happened. Gnawed at me. I'll come, I said, my voice shaking. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I knew that this was the right decision. It felt surreal driving back to the town I had once called home. The streets seemed smaller than I remembered. The houses were older, and my parents' house, well, it was just as I had left it, untouched by time, as if it had frozen the day I walked out. The front porch looked empty, cold, and uninviting, but I had no choice. I had to walk in. I rang the doorbell, and when my mother opened the door, she didn't say a word. She just stood there, looking at me as though she couldn't believe I was really there. Her face was drawn, pale, she looked older, fragile. For a second, I felt a stab of guilt for not having come sooner. Then she stepped aside, wordlessly inviting me in. The house felt like it had been abandoned. There was a thick layer of dust on the furniture, as if no one had bothered to live in it for years. But there was also something else, a tension in the air, a heaviness that made every movement feel like an intrusion. My father was sitting in the living room, his face tired, his hands shaking. The years had worn him down too. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, as if he were afraid to speak. And I realized, as I stood there in the doorway, that we had both been living in fear of this moment for far too long. I'm here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to apologize. My father finally spoke, his voice cracking, but we've made a mess of things. And your mother, she's asking for you. She wants to see you. She wants to make things right before it's too late. Walking into my parents' house after all these years felt like stepping into a different world, one that I didn't belong to anymore. But one I couldn't entirely forget. The smell of stale air and dust filled my lungs as I crossed the threshold. The walls seeming to close in on me as I stepped deeper into the living room. The furniture was old, like everything else in this place. But there was an undeniable weight to it now. It wasn't just the passage of time that hung in the air, it was the tension between us. I hadn't seen my father in years. Not since that day, the last time I saw him. He had been angry, his face flushed with rage. his words cutting through me like knives. But now, he looked smaller, older, and more fragile than I had remembered. His hair was thinning, his posture slumped, as if the years had stolen the man I once knew and replaced him with someone else, a person who didn't know how to make amends, but who desperately wanted to. My mother, on the other hand, seemed even more different. She had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together, no matter how much it fell apart. But now she was pale and frail, sitting in a chair by the window, her hands resting in her lap like she had no energy left to hold the world together anymore. Her eyes were tired, her gaze soft and distant. But when they met mine, I saw something that I hadn't expected: regret. Perhaps even guilt. I didn't know if it was for what had happened between us or for something else. But it was there, in the depths of her once unshakable confidence. "How is she?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to start this conversation, or even what I was expecting, but it was the question that lingered in my mind. My father didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his hands, wringing them nervously as if unsure of what to say. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. She's been sick for a while. Cancer. It's spread, and the doctors don't know how much time she has left." The words hit me like a slap in the face. Cancer. My mother, the woman who had always been in control, who had been the pillar of everything I thought I knew, was dying. A sudden rush of conflicting emotions flooded me. Anger, fear, sadness, guilt, but most of all, there was disbelief. I didn't know how to process the gravity of it all. The years apart seemed to collapse into a single moment, and I wasn't sure if I could ever be prepared for the truth. "Why didn't you tell me?" I managed to say, my voice trembling. "Why now, after everything? Why are you reaching out now?" I looked at my father, trying to make sense of it all. The betrayal, the years of silence, was it just because of her illness? Did they think that a phone call would suddenly make everything right? My father looked up at me, his face pained, his eyes filled with a kind of helplessness that I had never seen before. We didn't know how to reach you. After everything that happened, after how we treated you, we didn't think you'd want to hear from us. But your mother, she doesn't want to die with this between us. She needs you here." It wasn't the apology I had imagined. It wasn't even close to the one I thought I needed. But there was something in his voice, something in the rawness of his plea, that made me pause. He wasn't asking for forgiveness in the way I had expected. He was simply asking for a chance to be present, to show that they were still here, even if it was too late. And maybe that was the thing. It wasn't about what they had done to me, or what I had done to them. It was about what we hadn't done. What we had all failed to do. We had failed to talk, to listen, to really understand one another. My mother, who had been silent up until now, suddenly spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I'm sorry, honey. I'm so sorry for how we treated you. I should have supported you, not pushed you away. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I regret everything. All of it." The words were heavy, so much heavier than I had imagined. I had spent years holding on to my anger, building walls around my heart, convinced that I was justified in my resentment. But standing here, seeing the woman who had raised me, the woman who had been my role model, so small and vulnerable, I couldn't hold on to that anger any longer. I walked over to her slowly, my steps tentative, unsure of what to do, what to say, but then she reached out for me, her frail hands shaking as she took mine. And in that moment, I didn't know if I was forgiving her, or if I was forgiving myself for all the years of bitterness. The silence between us was thick, filled with unspoken words and long-forgotten feelings. But in the midst of it all, I realized something. This wasn't just about them. This was about me, too. I had spent so long waiting for them to make the first move, to apologize for what they had done to me. But in that moment, I realized that I was the one who had to let go. I was the one who had to open my heart again. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this. But I'm here." The tears came, then, without warning, not from anger, not from resentment, but from something deeper, something that had been buried under the surface for years. I didn't know if I could ever forgive them completely, but I knew that I needed to try. For me, for them, for the person I had become, and for the woman who had given me life. The days after I returned to my parents' house were strange, filled with awkward silences and unspoken words, but also with moments of unexpected tenderness. I could see the toll my mother's illness had taken on both of them. My father, once a proud, domineering figure, now seemed frail, his once broad shoulders sagging under the weight of regrets he had never vocalized. My mother, though she still had the fierce eyes that had once commanded a room, seemed distant, her energy draining with every passing day. She was a shell of the woman I had known. And yet, despite all of this, I couldn't help but wonder if they were the same people I had left behind. Were they still the parents who had disowned me, who had cast me aside when I refused to live by their rules? Or had something truly changed? I spent most of my time sitting quietly beside her, watching her, waiting for the words to come. My father would disappear into the kitchen to make dinner or sit silently in his chair, eyes glazed over as if he were afraid to think too much. But my mother, she was the one who needed me now. She was the one who wanted this to be right before it was too late. And it was clear that she was not just asking for forgiveness from me. She needed me to forgive her, to let go of the anger that had built up over all those years. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the half-finished painting that had been in my bag when I first arrived. I hadn't touched it since I walked through that door. The canvas had once been a symbol of escape, of everything I had worked so hard to create. But now it seemed so insignificant. What was the point of it all if I couldn't even figure out how to make sense of my own heart? I had tried to convince myself that I didn't need them, that I had built a life independent of their influence. A life that was mine and mine alone. But now, standing here with them again, I wasn't so sure. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. My father came into the room, setting a plate of food down in front of me. His eyes were tired, almost apologetic, but he didn't speak. He just sat across from me, watching me as though he were afraid I might slip away again. I wanted to ask him why. Why had they pushed me away all those years ago? Why had they let me go? Without even a second thought. But the question felt too big, too raw. Instead, I picked at my food, the silence between us stretching on. Then, my mother spoke from the living room, her voice faint but clear. We didn't know how to fix it. We didn't know how to fix us. Her words cut through the silence like a blade. And I looked up, surprised. It had been days since she had said anything more than a few sentences. But now she was reaching out, trying to connect in the only way she knew how. I got up from the table, leaving my unfinished meal behind, and walked toward her. She was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her once strong hands now trembling as they gripped the fabric. When she saw me approach, she looked up at me with the kind of vulnerability I had never seen in her before. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought if I could make you be like everyone else, if I could make you fit in, you'd be happy. But I see now that I only pushed you away. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Her words, simple as they were, pierced me. In that moment, the anger I had held onto for so long seemed to evaporate. It wasn't gone completely, not yet, but it felt smaller, more manageable. I could hear the regret in her voice, feel the weight of it in her trembling hands. She had made mistakes, huge ones, but she was owning them now. And maybe that was enough. I sat beside her, unsure of what to say, but knowing that I had to say something. I took her hand, the familiar warmth of it still there, though her fingers felt delicate, fragile in mine. "I don't know how to forgive you," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I wanted to take them back the moment they were out. But it was true. I didn't know how to let go of all the years of pain, of betrayal. But I also knew that this wasn't about making it all perfect. It was about taking the first step. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "I just need you to know that I love you. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I closed my eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the emotions that were crashing over me. But there was something in her words, something in the way she held me, that made me believe she was telling the truth. As the days passed, I spent more time with her, helping her with small tasks around the house, things she used to do without thinking, but now struggled with. We didn't talk about the past all the time. We didn't have to. Sometimes the silence between us felt like enough, as if we were both trying to rebuild what had been lost, piece by piece. My father, on the other hand, remained distant. He would still look at me occasionally, as if waiting for something, but I wasn't sure what he was waiting for. I didn't know if I could ever get past what had happened between us, or if I even wanted to. There were things that had been said that couldn't be taken back. But I was starting to understand that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, it was about healing. About moving forward despite the pain. The days were a blur, filled with quiet moments of reflection, and occasionally, painful realizations. My mother's condition worsened, her energy waning with each passing day. There were nights when I would stay up late, watching over her as she slept, and I would find myself wondering if it was already too late, if there was any way to truly repair what had been broken. But as the weeks went by, something began to shift within me. The anger that had once defined me seemed to fade, replaced by a fragile hope. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I wasn't willing to let the past define the rest of my life. I had to let go. I had to forgive. The house was quieter now. The hum of life that once filled it seemed to be fading away, replaced by the low murmur of medical equipment and the slow, steady rhythm of my mother's breathing. She was growing weaker by the day, and I could see the toll it was taking on my father. He had become even more withdrawn, spending long hours sitting by her side, his face a mask of exhaustion and quiet despair. I didn't know what to say to him anymore. I wasn't sure I had the words that could bridge the gap that still lay between us. There were days when I would catch him looking at me, his eyes filled with longing, and I would feel the weight of all the years that had passed between us. The anger I had carried for so long still simmered under the surface. But now, it was less about them and more about me, about the choices I had made. The way I had handled my own life. What did it all mean? What was the point of holding on to bitterness when time was running out? I found myself walking through the old house late at night, unable to sleep, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The place hadn't changed much in the years I had been gone. The faded wallpaper in the hallway, the old clock that still ticked away on the mantel, the pictures of us when we were a family, before everything fell apart. It all felt so distant now, like a life that belonged to someone else. I wandered into the kitchen, where my father was sitting at the table, staring at a half-empty glass of water. When he saw me, he didn't look away, didn't try to pretend everything was normal. He just sat there, waiting for me to say something, anything. But I had no words. What was there left to say? I poured myself a glass of water, letting the cool liquid settle in my hands as I tried to think of something, anything that could break the silence between us. It wasn't until I heard my mother's faint cough from the other room that I finally spoke. "She's not getting better, is she?" I said, my voice almost a whisper. My father didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his face unreadable. I had always known my father as a man of few words. Someone who kept everything locked inside, even when the weight of it threatened to crush him. But now, I could see the cracks, the exhaustion in his eyes, the lines of grief etched deep into his face. "No," he finally said, his voice low, filled with the kind of sorrow I had never heard from him before. "The doctors say she doesn't have much time. They've done all they can. She's fading." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with truth. It wasn't just my mother's physical decline that weighed on me, it was everything else. Too, the years that had been wasted, the things unsaid, the broken pieces of our family that we could never put back together. Even though we were here, together again, there was something that still felt unfinished. And I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know if I could. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, finally looking up at my father. "I don't know how to make this right. I don't even know if I can." The words came out faster than I expected, my voice trembling slightly as I spoke. The truth was, I was terrified. Terrified of losing my mother. Terrified of losing my father. Terrified of losing everything. We had already lost so much years of my life. Of love. Of connection. I didn't know how to hold on to what little we had left. My father took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging as he finally let out a long, slow exhale. "I know, son, I know." He paused, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. "I didn't know how to fix it either. I still don't, but we can try. We can try to make what time we have left count. For her, for us." I nodded, though the knot in my chest tightened. I wanted to believe him, but I wasn't sure I could. I wasn't sure if there was enough time to fix what had been broken. That night, I sat in the dark, alone in my childhood room, staring out the window at the moonlit sky. The stars were so distant, so far away, like everything I had once believed in. My thoughts spiraled out of control. Did I really want to fix this? Did I want to go back to the way things were? Or was it too late for that? I had spent so many years building a life outside of this place, carving out my own path, away from the suffocating expectations and the pain of rejection. But now, with my mother's illness looming over us, I found myself questioning everything. Was it possible to forgive them? To rebuild what had been destroyed, knowing that time was running out? Or was I doomed to repeat the same patterns of hurt, unable to escape the past? The next few days blurred together. I spent most of my time with my mother, sitting beside her as she drifted in and out of sleep. She would murmur my name sometimes, a faint whisper of recognition. But mostly, she seemed lost in her own world, caught between memories of the past and the fading present. But it wasn't just about her illness. It was about all of us, about the family we had been. The family we were trying to be again. And the family that had fallen apart because of stubbornness. pride, and fear. I sat down with my father one evening after dinner, both of us exhausted, but this time, there was something different, something that felt real. Maybe it was the shared weight of everything that had happened. Or maybe it was just the slow, painful realization that we couldn't go back. But I felt like we were beginning to understand each other again. In a way we hadn't for years. "I'm sorry, too," I said quietly, breaking the silence. My father looked up at me, his eyes soft, as if he hadn't expected those words from me. "I've spent so long being angry," I continued, the weight of the past pressing on me with every word. "I've held on to it, thinking it was the only way to protect myself. But I see now that it wasn't about protecting myself. It was about punishing you, punishing us." My father didn't speak at first, just sat there, taking in my words. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "We were wrong, too. We thought we were doing what was best for you. But we failed. I failed you, son. I'm sorry for that." It wasn't the perfect apology I had once dreamed of. But it was enough. It was more than enough. It was a start. And that's when I realized something, that we might never fully heal the wounds of the past. But that didn't mean we couldn't try. It didn't mean we couldn't rebuild what was broken, piece by fragile piece. It felt like time was slipping away, each day blending into the next with little distinction. The rhythmic beeping of the machines in my mother's room became a constant background noise. And I found myself losing track of the hours. I had been here for weeks now, staying at the house, watching her fade slowly into the distance. There was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't shake, something that clung to the walls, to the furniture, to the very air we breathed. The space felt too small for all of us. The memories, the regrets, the unspoken words, all pressing in on us, forcing us to face what we tried so hard to ignore. Every day, my mother became more distant, her eyes unfocused, her body weaker. She rarely spoke now, except for the occasional murmur that I couldn't understand. I stayed by her side as much as I could, holding her hand, brushing her hair back from her forehead, watching her drift in and out of sleep. It was a strange form of intimacy, one that neither of us had ever really known before. But there was something about it, something so profoundly sad, yet deeply human, that made me feel both closer to her and farther away than ever. I knew she was dying. I could see it in the way her skin had turned pale and almost translucent, in the way her breath became shallower each day. The doctors had said there was nothing more they could do. But still, we waited, holding on to whatever fragment of hope we could grasp. One evening, as I sat at her bedside, watching her struggle to breathe, I felt my father's presence behind me. I hadn't noticed him enter the room. He was standing at the door, looking at us both with a mix of sadness and regret. He had been so distant, so withdrawn, that it took me a moment to remember that he was still here, still present, despite everything. I didn't turn to acknowledge him right away. I couldn't. There was too much pain between us, too much history we had never addressed. And now, with my mother fading, it felt almost too late to start. But my father didn't move. He just stood there, looking at her, his eyes reflecting something I hadn't seen before: vulnerability. He had always been the strong one, the pillar, the man who was never supposed to crack. But now, he seemed so small, so human. "I never thought it would end like this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. His words seemed to hang in the air, as if they carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of regret. I didn't know how to respond. What was there to say? We had spent years apart, disconnected, and now, here we were, at the edge of something irreversible. I wanted to say something to him, to comfort him, or to tell him that I understood, but the words wouldn't come. I felt so lost in my own grief that I couldn't reach out, even to him. Instead, I stayed silent, my gaze fixed on my mother's face. I watched her chest rise and fall, the steady rhythm of her breath that was no longer so steady. And in that moment, something in me broke. It was as if all the walls I had built around my heart, all the anger and hurt that had been festering for years, suddenly shattered. I was tired of being angry, tired of holding on to the past. And yet, I didn't know how to let it go. Not yet. "I'm sorry," my father said, his voice almost a whisper now, as if he were afraid to disturb the fragile moment. He took a step forward, closer to my mother's bed, but not too close. He seemed to want to keep a respectful distance, though the distance between us was still so wide. "I'm sorry for everything," he repeated, his voice breaking. The apology hung in the air, and for the first time, I felt something shift. It wasn't a magic moment of healing, where everything was forgiven and forgotten, but it was something. It was a crack in the armor we had built around ourselves. Maybe we wouldn't ever get everything back, but we could, at least, Take a step toward understanding. Toward peace. I finally turned to him. My face still wet with the tears I hadn't realized I had shed. I know, I said, my voice hoarse. I didn't have to say more. There was so much more left unsaid. But it didn't matter anymore. In that one moment, we shared the same understanding. The same grief. We were, for once, in the same place. The next few days passed in a blur. The doctors had said it wouldn't be long now. My mother's condition worsened, and I found myself thinking about all the things I wished I had done differently. There were so many regrets, so many moments in time that I couldn't get back. But I couldn't live in those moments anymore. I couldn't hold on to them like they were the only thing that mattered. In the final hours of my mother's life, I sat by her side alone. My father had gone to get some rest, exhausted from the constant vigil, and I had insisted he take a break. I didn't know why, but in that moment, I didn't want to be alone. I didn't want to face the inevitable without someone there. Her breathing had become so shallow now, her once strong hands lying limp at her sides. I held one of them in my own, the coolness of her skin a stark contrast to the warmth I remembered. Her eyes were closed, and I wasn't sure if she could still hear me, but I spoke anyway. "Mom, I'm here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know things were hard between us. I know I've been angry, but I want you to know that I'm not angry anymore. I'm just so sorry for everything we missed." I felt the sting of my own words. I was sorry, but it felt like it was too late for apologies. I didn't want to leave things like this. I didn't want her to leave with the weight of our unresolved past between us. But I didn't know how to make it right. Her fingers twitched, just for a moment, and I thought I might be imagining it. But then, slowly, her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at me. Her gaze was unfocused, her eyes clouded with exhaustion, but there was something in them, a flicker of recognition, of love that made my heart ache. "I love you," she murmured, so softly that I almost didn't hear it. Tears welled in my eyes, and I squeezed her hand tighter. "I love you too, Mom." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of our past. I didn't feel the anger. I didn't feel the resentment. In that fleeting moment, it was just us, just a mother and a son, connected by something deeper than all the hurt we had carried. It wasn't a perfect moment. It wasn't an ending without pain. But it was enough. And as my mother's breathing slowed, and the room grew quiet, I knew that even if we couldn't undo the past, we could, at least, make the most of the time we had left. The funeral was a quiet affair. There were no grand speeches. No eulogies filled with grand memories. My mother had never been one for fanfare. And so, in her passing, we honored her with the same quiet dignity she had always preferred. There were a few people from the church, old family friends, but mostly, it was just me, my father, and a handful of others who knew her in passing, if they even knew her at all. I stood at the back of the room, my hands clasped tightly in front of me, my eyes fixed on the casket. The room was full of mourning, full of loss. But it didn't feel like my loss. It felt like a distant thing, like something that happened to someone else. In those first few hours after my mother passed, I was numb, unable to comprehend the weight of what had just happened. The truth is, I wasn't prepared for her death, despite all the time I had spent with her during her final days. Despite knowing in my heart that her time was coming to an end. Nothing could truly prepare me for the overwhelming emptiness that settled over me when she was finally gone. It wasn't just the absence of her physical presence. It was the suddenness, the realization that everything I had known about family, about us, had ended. And it wasn't just that she was gone. It was everything else too, the years I had spent away from them. The years we had spent apart, all the unspoken words, the anger, the misunderstandings. When she died, it felt like the final chapter of something that had been broken long before her illness ever started. I watched as my father stood beside the casket, his face as unreadable as ever. His grief was quieter, more private, but I could see the toll it had taken on him. He was thinner than I remembered. His shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. I wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but the distance between us felt vast. We had never been close. And now, after everything, I didn't know if we could be. The funeral ended, and people slowly began to trickle out, offering their condolences in hushed voices. I stayed by the graveside with my father for a while, neither of us saying anything. It was a strange, shared silence that felt both uncomfortable and necessary. I could feel his presence beside me. But it wasn't like before. It wasn't like we were a family again. It was simply two people, standing in the shadow of a grave, each carrying their own burdens of grief. When we finally left, my father didn't speak. We got in the car, and I drove us back to the house in silence. The ride felt long, stretched out by the weight of everything between us. Neither of us knew what to say. My father's eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his face a mask of exhaustion. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. There was so much I wanted to say, so much I needed to say, but the words felt so small, so inadequate. We returned to the house, the place that once felt like home but now felt cold, empty. My mother's absence was palpable, like a presence that had once filled every corner of the house and now left it hollow. I didn't know where to begin. How could I? My father went straight to the living room and sat down in his usual chair. He looked worn, his eyes distant. I stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do. It felt like the final act of our relationship was happening in slow motion. Like we were both waiting for something to happen that would change everything. But nothing happened. We just existed, in the same space, without knowing how to move forward. Dad, my voice came out softer than I expected, fragile in the silence of the house. He didn't look up at me. I wasn't sure if he had heard me or if he was just too tired to respond. I know, he finally said, his voice thick with exhaustion. I know you're angry. You've been angry for a long time. And I understand that. I've been angry too. I froze. The words hung in the air like a sudden burst of light in a dark room. My father had never said anything like that before, not to me. Not about us. It was like a window had opened between us, one I didn't know how to navigate. I'm not angry anymore, I said, though the words felt like a lie. Or maybe just an incomplete truth. I just don't know what to do now. I don't know how to keep going. The silence stretched between us, thick and unyielding. We were two people trapped in our own grief, unsure of how to move forward, unsure of what to say to each other. But in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was a shift, a small crack in the wall between us. I don't know either, he replied quietly, his voice so low I almost didn't hear it. But I'm still here. We're still here, son. I don't know how to fix everything, but I'm not going anywhere. I looked at him then, really looked at him. He was tired, beaten down by the weight of the last few weeks, and the years of our strained relationship. He had always been a man who kept his emotions hidden, locked away, but now, in this moment, I saw something different in him, a vulnerability I had never expected to see. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't the father I had wanted him to be, but he was here, and that, somehow, was enough. We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. The air between us had shifted, and for the first time in years, it felt like there was room for something new. Maybe not complete healing, but a possibility, a chance to rebuild, however slowly, however painfully. As I stood there in the quiet house, looking at my father, I felt a pang of something deep inside me, something that I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the beginning of something else. Something yet to come. It was going to take time. It was going to be hard. There would be days when the weight of the past would come crashing down again. But there was a new understanding between us now. Something fragile but real. We would have to rebuild from the ground up, one small step at a time. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like that was enough. It's funny how grief has a way of taking on many shapes, how it lingers like a shadow that won't let you go. Some days, it's quiet, a dull ache in the back of your mind, like an old scar. Other days, it's sharp, a sudden, unexpected pang that catches you off guard, like the emptiness of an echo long after the sound has faded. In the weeks after the funeral, I found myself waking up early, unable to sleep, my mind always a step ahead of me. The mornings felt the hardest, those early hours when the world outside was still dark and quiet. And everything felt heavy, almost suffocating. It was hard to shake the feeling that something had changed, that a chapter had closed. But I wasn't sure how to turn the page. I spent my days at the house. Mostly, it didn't feel like home anymore. Not really. There was too much history here, too much old pain. I hadn't lived here in years. Not since I left after my family had disowned me. But now, after my mother's death, I found myself returning to the same place. As if some part of me was still searching for the sense of security I had lost when I walked out the door all those years ago. My father, too, was a ghost of himself. His usual routine was gone. There were no more early morning walks to the store, no more late night cups of coffee in front of the TV. He moved slowly now, as though the weight of my mother's death had drained all the life out of him. We didn't talk much. I don't know if either of us knew how to. The silence between us was both comforting and painful. Comforting because it meant we didn't have to say anything, but painful because it reminded me of everything we hadn't shared. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, sorting through some of my mother's old things. My father entered the room. He looked at me for a moment before he spoke, his voice hoarse from the grief he had kept bottled up. "I'm not sure what to do now," he said, his words simple, but full of meaning. "I don't know how to move on from this." I looked up at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. My father had never been one to open up about his emotions. He had always been a man of few words, a man who kept his thoughts locked away in some deep, private place. But now, it felt different. We were both broken in our own ways. And in that moment, I realized that we were both lost. "I don't know either," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix anything." He nodded slowly, as if he understood. There was no need to explain further. There were no answers, no quick fixes. We were both living with the weight of so much regret and so many unanswered questions. But perhaps, for the first time, we both understood that the healing wasn't going to come overnight. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound in the room the soft hum of the refrigerator. For a moment, I allowed myself to just be with my father, in this shared space of grief. It wasn't comfortable, but it was something. It was a kind of togetherness that I hadn't known in years. A kind of tentative hope that we could begin again, even if we didn't have the answers. Days passed, and life continued in its quiet, relentless march. I found myself going through the motions, cooking meals, doing the laundry, taking care of small things around the house, anything to keep busy. There was a strange sense of normalcy in the mundane tasks, as if they provided a fleeting sense of control in a world that felt so out of balance. But even in the midst of these routines, I couldn't escape the grief. It was like a weight that had settled deep inside me, a constant pressure that never fully went away. I had always been good at keeping my emotions in check, at burying them beneath the surface. But now they were impossible to ignore. I felt lost, untethered. One afternoon, after I had spent hours sorting through old family albums, photos of happier times, my father came into the room. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, watching me as I flipped through the pages. Finally, he stepped forward, slowly, his movements stiff. "I never wanted things to be like this," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight I had never heard before. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to lose you." I didn't know how to respond. I had spent so many years carrying my anger toward him, so many years feeling abandoned and unloved, that I wasn't sure how to let go of all that hurt. But in this moment, his apology, his admission of guilt, caught me off guard. "I know," I said softly, "I know, Dad, but I've spent so much time being angry that I forgot. I forgot how much I needed you, how much I still need you." There was a long pause. And then, finally, he reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder, tentative, almost unsure. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement of all the years we had spent apart. It was a quiet promise that, maybe, we could start over, even if the past would never be fully erased. As the weeks wore on, something started to shift between my father and me. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy. There were days when the grief would overwhelm us, days when the silence between us was deafening. But there were also moments, small moments, when we started to rebuild. We'd sit together in the evenings, talking about nothing in particular, but slowly finding a way to re-establish a connection. He'd tell me stories about my mother, stories I had never heard before, and I'd listen. Not with judgment or bitterness, but with an openness that I hadn't known I still had in me. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, and I didn't expect it to be, but it was real, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like we were both learning how to move forward together. I began to take small steps toward healing. Too, I started seeing a therapist, something I had resisted for years. I didn't want to face all the things I had buried for so long. But I knew it was time. I knew I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. And as I began to untangle the knots of my own grief, I realized something. Healing wasn't about fixing everything at once. It wasn't about making everything okay again. It was about finding a way to live with the pain, to carry it with you without letting it consume you. It was about accepting that sometimes the past will always be there, but that doesn't mean you can't still find peace. There was a point, a few weeks after the funeral, when I started to notice the change in the air between my father and me. It wasn't anything dramatic, nothing like the sudden embrace of a long-lost relationship. It wasn't that easy, but something was shifting, slowly, cautiously. We were finding our way back to each other, not because we had all the answers, but because we had learned, perhaps for the first time, that we couldn't keep living in the shadows of the past. It wasn't perfect. In fact, there were days when it felt like we were just pretending, like we were still two strangers in the same house. circling each other without ever really touching. But it was a start. I knew that, and it was in the quiet moments that I began to feel the small spark of hope that we could make it. Whatever making it meant, I had decided, not long after my mother's death, that I needed to understand my own grief better. The truth was, I hadn't really allowed myself to grieve. I had spent so much time running from it, hiding from the depth of the pain, that I didn't even know what real loss felt like anymore. My mother's passing had cracked open a door I had locked for years. And I realized that I couldn't keep pretending it wasn't there. So, I sought help, something I never thought I'd do. It was my therapist who first suggested I try writing about my experiences. I was reluctant at first. The idea of putting my emotions on paper seemed almost trivial. But I did it anyway. In the safety of my room, with only the dim light of a lamp and the quiet hum of the house around me. I began to write. I wrote about my mother, about the years I had spent away from my family, about the anger and the sadness that had built up inside me. And, inevitably, I wrote about my father. I started to see patterns I had ignored for years, buried beneath layers of resentment and confusion. I wrote about how my father's silence had always felt like a wall between us. How his refusal to show vulnerability had shaped my own inability to express myself. I wrote about the fight we'd had before I left, the harsh words we'd exchanged, and how neither of us had ever bothered to take a step back and truly listen. In those late-night writing sessions, I began to untangle the complexity of it all. It wasn't just that my father and I had been at odds. It was that we were both trapped in a cycle of hurt, neither of us knowing how to break free. My mother's illness had been a catalyst, but it wasn't the cause. We had been fractured long before her sickness ever took hold. One evening, a few weeks after I'd started writing, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of me. My father came in quietly, as he always did, and stood in the doorway, watching me. There was a pause, an unspoken question in the air between us. He had always been someone who watched more than he spoke, his way of processing, I suppose, but tonight, there was something different in his gaze. I could feel the weight of it, the silent invitation for me to speak. And for the first time in years, I was ready to. I've been writing, I said, my voice tentative at first. About everything. About us. About Mom. My father didn't say anything at first. He just nodded, his eyes flicking to the stack of papers on the table. You've been keeping it to yourself all this time, he said quietly. You never let us see you. Never let me see you. The words hit harder than I expected. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even angry. It was simply the truth. I didn't know how, I replied, my throat tightening. I didn't know how to let you see me when I didn't know who I was. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring at the table, his eyes unfocused. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, he said something I wasn't expecting. I don't know how to fix it either. Son, I don't know how to fix us. But I want to try. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wasn't sure if I was hearing him right. My father, the man who had always been so distant, so locked away, was saying he wanted to try. He wanted to fix something that felt irreparably broken. I didn't know what to say. It was too much, too soon, but it was also everything I had wanted to hear. I realized, then, that my father's silence wasn't just a refusal to engage, it was his own way of dealing with his own pain. He didn't know how to reach out, because he had never been shown how. We were both walking in the dark, fumbling for a way out, but neither of us had ever truly trusted the other to take that first step. You don't have to fix it all at once, I said after a long silence. We don't have to fix everything, but maybe we can start by just being here, by just being honest. He nodded, his hand twitching at his side, like he wanted to reach out but didn't know how. It was enough, though. That small gesture was enough for me. I didn't need him to fix everything. I didn't even need him to understand everything. I just needed him to be here. For the next few weeks, we started making small changes. We didn't talk about everything at once. There were no grand apologies or revelations. But we spent more time together, sitting in the same room, watching the television, doing the mundane things that had once been so ordinary but now felt like acts of healing. We ate dinner together at the table. And when we did, we didn't talk about the past. We talked about the present, about what we liked to watch on TV. About the weather, about anything that didn't hurt. I knew it wasn't perfect. I knew we couldn't just erase the years of silence and anger. But I also knew that we were beginning to find our way back to each other. And that, in itself, was a kind of miracle. There was one evening, about a month after that conversation at the kitchen table, when I found myself sitting on the back porch with my father. It was a cool evening. The kind of late summer night when the air is crisp and the cicadas buzz in the distance. I had been writing again, but I had left the notebook inside. My father was sitting in his chair, his hands folded in his lap, looking out into the darkened yard. I was struck by how much he had changed. The weight of grief was still there, lingering in his face, but there was something else too, something softer. It wasn't just the lines in his face that had deepened over the years, but the way he seemed to wear them now, as though he had finally come to terms with them. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost lost in the stillness of the night. "I didn't know how much I hurt you. I didn't know how much I hurt us. I didn't say anything at first." The words were heavy, and part of me didn't know how to respond. I had spent so long holding on to the past, to the anger and the disappointment, that I wasn't sure how to let go of it all. But in that moment, I realized something. The apology wasn't going to fix everything, and it didn't need to. But it was a start, a beginning. "It's not just about the apology," I said, my voice soft in the cool night air. "It's about the time, the moments. We don't need to fix everything, but we need to keep showing up." My father nodded, his eyes still focused on the yard. "We will," he said simply. It's strange how something as ordinary as waking up can feel like a battle some days. The weight of grief, the responsibility of being present. It all collides with the mundane parts of life that you can't escape. There are mornings when I wish I could simply stay in bed, hide from the world, and pretend that nothing has changed. But life doesn't stop for anyone, not even for the broken. I had started running again. It wasn't because I had any grand aspirations of fitness or self-improvement. No, it was because running was the one thing that seemed to clear my mind. The rhythmic pounding of my feet on the pavement, the cool rush of air in my lungs, it gave me a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I didn't think about my father, or my mother's death, or the mess of emotions I was still trying to sort through. I just ran. It wasn't a long run, just a few miles around the block, but it was enough to get my blood pumping, to make me feel something other than the heaviness that had settled in my chest. That morning, after I finished my run, I stood on the front porch, hands on my knees, breathing heavily as I looked out over the quiet street. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the world. I could hear the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. When I went inside, I found my father sitting at the kitchen table, his usual spot, reading the newspaper. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes studying me for a moment before he nodded in acknowledgement. "You went running again," he said, his voice neutral, as though it were just an ordinary observation. "Yeah," I replied, still catching my breath. "It helps clear my head." He didn't say anything else, just went back to his newspaper. But I could feel him watching me, could feel the way his gaze lingered on me. He was the kind of man who didn't ask many questions, and I hadn't offered up much in the way of conversation either. But today, something felt different. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice hesitant, "about us, about everything." I sat down at the table across from him, unsure of where this conversation might lead. We had never been good at talking openly about our feelings, not before my mother's illness, and certainly not after. But now, there was a new kind of quiet tension between us. It was as if we were both tiptoeing around the mess of emotions, afraid to take the next step. "I know," I said slowly, "I've been thinking too." There was a long pause. He folded the newspaper and set it aside, his hands lingering on the table. He wasn't looking at me directly, but I could sense that his mind was working, processing something that he hadn't yet found the words for. "I don't know how to fix things," he said quietly. "I don't know how to make up for everything I've done, or didn't do." I felt the familiar knot tighten in my chest. The guilt, the regret, it was something we both carried, but neither of us had ever known how to talk about it. "I don't expect you to fix everything," I said softly, my eyes on the table. "I just need you to show up, to be here. That's all I ever really wanted from you." He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine. There was an intensity there, a vulnerability that I hadn't seen before. For a moment, it was as if he was seeing me for the first time, not as his son, not as the person he had failed, but as someone who had his own pain, his own struggles. "I'm here," he said quietly. "I'll be here, I promise." It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a promise to fix everything. But it was a start. A small, fragile step towards something more. Something real. The next few weeks passed by in a blur of small moments, shared meals, late-night conversations, and the kind of quiet understanding that was still foreign but not entirely uncomfortable. I had started to find a rhythm in my life again, I was running more regularly, picking up old hobbies, and even considering looking for work. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life now. Everything felt uncertain, but the idea of moving forward, even in small steps, was comforting. One afternoon, I found myself sitting on the porch, sipping coffee, when my father came out to join me. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood beside me, looking out at the yard, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. I was thinking, he said after a long silence, his voice sounding distant as if he were lost in thought. Maybe you should get out of here. Not forever, just for a while. Go somewhere, do something for yourself. I raised an eyebrow, not sure if I'd heard him correctly. What do you mean? He turned to face me then, his expression soft, but there was an urgency in his voice. I mean, you've been here long enough. You've been helping me, but you've got your own life to live. You've got things you need to figure out. And I think it's time you start figuring them out. Whatever that means. For the first time in weeks, I was struck by a sense of possibility. It was like a door had opened that I hadn't even realized was there. I had been so focused on trying to repair the damage between my father and me that I had forgotten about myself. I had forgotten that I needed to find my own path again. I don't know, I said slowly. I don't even know what I want to do with my life anymore. He gave me a small, understanding smile. You don't have to know right now, but you need to start looking. You can't stay here forever. And you shouldn't. Not for me. Not because of me. It wasn't a dismissal. It wasn't an order. It was a nudge. A gentle push towards something new. I sat there for a long time, thinking about his words. What did I want? What was I supposed to do now? For the first time in so long, I realized that the world was wide open. There were no expectations, no rules. I could go anywhere, do anything. I didn't have to stay stuck in the past, anchored by the grief I had carried for so long. Later that week, I started looking into potential job opportunities. I reached out to a few old contacts, explored the possibility of going back to school, and even thought about traveling, taking a trip to somewhere far away, just to see if I could find myself in a new environment. It felt good, this idea of possibility. It felt like a fresh start, even if I didn't have all the answers. I hadn't realized how much I needed it, the freedom to make choices for myself, to take the reins of my life again. The bond with my father was still fragile, but I felt a growing sense of peace in knowing that, despite everything, we were both trying to heal, trying to move forward, and maybe that was enough for now.